He's long gone. That was the sentence that didn't make sense, not to a mother, not to me, not after 68 years of knowing exactly what goodbye is supposed to sound like. Because goodbye is a time, a place, a moment you can hold on to, not something that disappears into thin air without a trace. And yet that was all Jessica gave me when I asked the simplest question a mother can ask. What time is my son's funeral? And I remember standing there in my kitchen in Ohio, my hand still wrapped around the phone, the kettle humming softly behind me, the smell of chamomile rising into the air like any other quiet morning, except nothing about that moment was quiet anymore, because something in her voice had already closed a door I didn't know existed, something final, something practiced, like she had rehearsed those 3 words and placed them carefully between us. And for a second, I thought maybe I had misheard her. Maybe the line had cracked. Maybe she meant something else, but Jessica doesn't misspeak. She never has, not in the 15 years she's been in my life, not in the way she measures every word like it costs money. So I asked again, slower this time, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like I was already losing something I hadn't even been told I lost. And there was a pause on the other end, not long, just enough to make me aware of it, just enough to feel intentional. And then she repeated it, softer but sharper somehow. He's long gone. And that was when the room around me seemed to shift, not dramatically, not like in the movies, just a subtle tilt, like something had been moved an inch to the left and nothing would ever line up the same again. Because Daniel was my son, my only son, and people don't just become long gone, without a date, without a service, without a call to their mother. And I realized in that moment that I hadn't been told anything at all. No hospital, no accident, no timeline, just an ending with no beginning. And I tried to piece it together the way you do when something doesn't add up. You go back to the last time things made sense, the last call, the last message, but even that felt distant now, like it belonged to a different version of my life. And I remember saying his name, just his name, Daniel, as if that alone might bring the conversation back to something real. But Jessica didn't respond to that. She never uses his name when she doesn't have to. And instead she shifted the subject in that careful way she has, asking if I was taking care of myself, as if that was the question that mattered. And I knew then that whatever had happened, whatever had already been, decided without me. I was standing outside of it, looking in through a window that had already been closed, and I didn't raise my voice, I didn't demand answers, because something told me that wouldn't work, not with her, not like this. So I just stood there, listening to the quiet on the line, feeling the weight of 3 words settle into something much heavier, something that didn't feel like grief yet, because grief needs truth. And all I had was a sentence that didn't make sense, and a silence that felt far too deliberate to be accidental. I did not hang up right away, even after she stopped speaking, because sometimes silence says more than words ever could, and I wanted to hear if there was anything behind it, any hint that she might correct herself, soften it, give me something I could hold on to. But there was nothing, just a faint background noise on her end that sounded like movement, like drawers opening or closing, like life continuing as if nothing had shifted at all. And that was the part that unsettled me the most. Not what she said, but how easily she moved past it, as if my question had been answered completely, as if there was nothing more a mother needed to know. And I finally pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. Her name's still there, Jessica Collins. And for a moment I considered calling Daniel directly, out of instinct more than logic, because that is what I have done my entire life. When something fell off, I called my son. But something stopped me, something quiet but firm, like a hand resting on my shoulder, telling me that whatever I would hear on the other end, if anything at all, would not bring clarity. So instead I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, right next to the kettle that had already gone still, and I noticed the cup I had prepared for him out of habit, even though he had not visited in months. The same blue mug he always used when he came by on Sunday mornings, and I had not realized until that moment that I had kept doing that, setting out 2 cups instead of 1, as if routine could hold a place for someone even when they stopped showing up. And I stood there for a long time, not thinking in full sentences, just fragments, pieces that did not connect, because nothing about this connected, not the lack of a call, not the absence of details, not the way Jessica spoke as if everything had already been settled somewhere far away from me. And then I did what I have always done when something does not make sense. I looked for something small, something concrete. So I opened the drawer where I keep old birthday cards, receipts, little things people forget, but I never throw away, and I found the last card Daniel had sent me. It was from 3 months ago, nothing special, just a simple message. But his handwriting was there, steady and familiar, and I traced it with my finger as if it might tell me how a life goes from that to long gone, without passing through me first. And I realized then that this was not just about losing him. It was about being removed from the moment of losing him, as if that moment had been taken and placed somewhere I was not allowed to go, and I began to replay every recent memory with Jessica, every conversation, every visit that felt slightly shorter than it used to be, every time she answered for him before he could speak, and none of it had seemed important at the time, just small things, things you do not question because you trust the people closest to you. But now those small things were lining up in a way that made me uneasy, like puzzle pieces forming an image I was not ready to see, and I walked over to the calendar hanging on the wall, the one I still update by hand even though my granddaughter once told me I should use my phone instead, and I started counting backward from today, marking the last time I had spoken to Daniel, the last time he said he would call me again soon, and I noticed the gap, longer than usual, but not long enough to explain what I had just been told. Not long enough to justify a life ending and a farewell happening without me. And that was when a thought settled in, not loud, not dramatic, just clear, that whatever had happened, it had not unfolded the way it should have, and more importantly, it had not unfolded with me in it. And I knew then that waiting for answers would not bring them, because the silence I had just heard was not confusion, it was control, and if I wanted to understand what had been taken from me, I would have to start looking in places where no one expected me to look. The first place I called was the funeral home on Maple Street, the one our family has used for as long as I can remember, not because I believed he had to be there, but because it was the only place that still felt connected to something real, something structured, something that follows rules, and I asked the woman who answered if they had any arrangements under the name Daniel Collins, and there was a brief pause as she typed, the soft clicking of keys filling the silence in a way that felt almost too loud. And then she said no, nothing under that name, and I thanked her, calmly, as if that answer meant nothing, even though it should have meant everything, because funerals do not just disappear, they leave records, they leave traces, and when I hung up, I did not rush to the next call, I simply stood there again, letting that absence settle into place beside everything else that did not make sense. And then I tried another funeral home across town, one I had only heard of, and the answer was the same, polite, professional, and empty, and with each call I made, the world did not become clearer, it became quieter, as if I was stepping into a space where information had been carefully removed, not lost, not forgotten, but taken, and I began to understand that this was not confusion, it was design, and I thought about Jessica, about the way she organizes everything, the way she plans holidays down to the hour, the way she once corrected me for arriving 10 minutes early to a dinner she hosted, as if time itself belonged to her. And it occurred to me that if there was no record, it was because she had chosen where that record would exist and where it would not. And I moved on to the hospital Daniel had mentioned during our last conversation, the one 20 minutes from his house. And I asked to speak with someone about a recent patient, giving his full name, my voice steady, my words careful, and the woman on the line told me she could not release information without proper authorization, which I understood. Of course I did. Rules are meant to protect people. But I also knew what it sounded like when something simply did not exist, and this was not that. This was a door that required a key I did not have. And when I ended that call, I did not feel defeated. I felt something else, something quieter but sharper, a kind of clarity that comes when you realize you are not being kept out by accident. And I walked back into the kitchen, past the blue mug, past the calendar, and I sat down at the table where I used to sit across from Daniel on Sunday mornings, and I let my hands rest flat against the wood, grounding myself in something solid, something that had not changed, and I started to think not about where he was, but about when everything shifted, when the distance began, and every memory led back to the same pattern, Jessica answering his phone more often, Jessica speaking for him during visits, Jessica deciding when they would come, when they would leave, always with a smile, always polite, never enough to question directly, but enough to shape the space around him. and I realized then that I had been adjusting to her rhythm without noticing, allowing her to set the pace of my own relationship with my son, and that realization did not come with anger, not yet. It came with something colder, something more precise, because if she had been shaping that space for years, then whatever had happened now was not sudden. It was the result of something that had been building quietly, carefully, step by step, and I understood that the answers I was looking for would not be given to me in a single conversation, not from her, not from anyone who stood within that controlled space, which meant I would have to step outside of it completely, look at what remained, what was left untouched, and follow that instead, because somewhere between the silence, the missing records, and the careful words, there was a truth, and it was not hidden by accident. The next place I looked was not a building or a phone number, but something quieter, something most people forget leaves a trace, and that was Daniel's bank. Because money does not disappear the way people try to make information disappear. It moves, it records, it leaves behind a pattern whether anyone wants it to or not. And I still had access to one of the older joint accounts we opened years ago, an account he never fully closed. Even after he married Jessica, and I had not checked it in months, not because I did not care, but because I trusted that whatever he needed, he would handle. And I logged in slowly, carefully entering the password I had not used in a long time. And when the screen finally loaded, I did not scroll right away. I simply looked at the last updated date. And it was recent, far more recent than it should have been if everything had already ended the way Jessica suggested. And that alone told me something important. That life had continued in some form, beyond what I had been told. And I began to scroll through the transactions, not searching for anything specific at first, just letting the entries pass one by one, grocery stores, gas stations, small purchases that looked ordinary, almost comforting in their normalcy, until they stopped, not gradually, not fading out, but stopping cleanly on a date that stood out immediately, a date I recognized without needing to check the calendar, because it was just 2 weeks ago, and there were no transactions after that. Nothing, not even a small charge, and I stared at that line for a long time. Because endings that come that suddenly are never natural. They are decided, they are executed, and I noticed something else, something smaller but just as telling. The final transactions were not made near his home. They were made near a medical center across town, one I had not called yet, and I wrote down the name on a piece of paper, not trusting myself to remember it later, and I sat back in the chair, letting that information settle into place beside everything else. And I thought about how carefully this had all been arranged, how the absence of a funeral, the lack of records, the controlled words, and now this sudden stop in activity all pointed in the same direction, not toward confusion, but toward a timeline that had been managed without me, and I realized then that Jessica had not just withheld information, she had redirected it, guiding every path away from me, leaving only fragments behind, fragments that most people would overlook because they seem too small to matter, but small things are where the truth hides when larger things are controlled. And I picked up the phone again, not to call her, not yet, but to call the medical center listed on the transaction. And when the receptionist answered, I introduced myself with the same calm tone I had used all morning, giving Daniel's full name, asking if he had been admitted recently. And again there was that pause, that quiet moment where someone checks something they are not sure they should be sharing. And she told me she could not provide details, but her tone shifted slightly, just enough for me to hear it, just enough to know that I was no longer asking the wrong questions, and I thanked her, ending the call without pressing further, because I had already learned that pushing too hard too soon closes doors, and I needed them open, even if only slightly. And I placed the phone back on the table, looking at the piece of paper with the name of the medical center written in my own handwriting. And I understood that this was no longer about waiting for someone to tell me what happened. It was about following what remained, step by step, without announcing it, without confronting anyone. Because whatever had been done quietly, and the only way to see it clearly was to move just as quietly in return. And for the first time since that sentence was spoken to me, I did not feel lost. I felt certain of one thing, that the truth had not been erased. It had only been moved, and I was beginning to see exactly where to look next. I did not drive to the medical center right away, even though every instinct told me to get in the car and demand answers at the front desk, because I had already seen how quickly doors close when you arrive uninvited and unprepared. And instead I sat there a little longer, looking at the name I had written down, letting it settle into something more than just a location, something that fit into a pattern I was beginning to recognize. And I reached for my phone again, this time not to call, but to search, because sometimes information reveals itself differently when you are not asking directly. And I found the website for the medical center, scrolling through pages that listed departments, services, visiting hours, all the ordinary things meant for patients and families who are included, and I noticed something that stood out. A small section about hospice care, about end-of-life support, written in calm, reassuring language that felt strangely distant from the silence I had been given, and I stared at that section longer than I expected to, because it introduced a possibility I had not allowed myself to consider yet, not because it was impossible, but because it would mean that time had existed, time that had been used without me. And I closed the page slowly, setting the phone down again, and I looked around my kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. Every object exactly where it had always been, every detail unchanged, and yet everything felt slightly out of place, as if I had stepped into a version of my own life that had moved forward without telling me. And I stood up and walked to the window, watching the quiet street outside, a car passing by, a neighbor walking her dog, the world continuing in a way that felt almost indifferent, and I realized that whatever had happened to Daniel had unfolded within that same ordinary flow, hidden in plain sight, not dramatic, not chaotic, but controlled, measured, and that thought settled into something firm inside me, because control leaves patterns, and patterns can be followed. And I went back to the table, pulling out an old notebook I had not used in years, the kind with lined pages and a soft cover, and I began to write, not emotions, not questions, just facts, the date of the last transaction, the name of the medical center, the responses I had received from the funeral homes, the exact words Jessica had used, because I understood now that memory alone was not enough. I needed structure. I needed to see it laid out in front of me. And as I wrote, something became clearer, not all at once, but piece by piece. The timeline was not just incomplete. It was intentionally narrowed, reduced to a single statement that removed every detail that might lead back to me. And I thought about the last time I had seen Daniel in person, the way he had stood in this very kitchen, holding that same blue mug, his voice softer than usual, his eyes drifting toward Jessica more often than they used to. And I remembered how she had answered a question for him before he could finish it. Something small, something I had let pass at the time, and now it did not feel small anymore. It felt like a glimpse of something I had not fully understood, and I sat there, pen still in my hand, realizing that the version of events I had been given was not just incomplete, it was constructed, shaped carefully to prevent exactly what I was doing now. And that realization did not bring panic, it brought focus, because once something is constructed, it can also be taken apart, piece by piece, and I closed the notebook gently, placing it beside the piece of paper with the medical center's name, and I made a quiet decision, not spoken, not announced, just understood, that I would go there, but not as a mother demanding answers, not yet. I would go as someone who already knew that the truth existed behind a door that had been kept just slightly closed, and all I needed was the right moment, the right question, and the patience to wait until that door opened just enough for me to see what had been hidden all along. I waited until the next morning before I went to the medical center, not because I needed more time to think, but because I understood that timing matters when you are walking into a place where you are not expected, and I chose a quiet hour, just after 9, when the early rush had settled but the day had not yet grown crowded, and the drive there took 23 minutes from my house, a route I followed carefully, noticing details I would normally ignore, the stoplights, the small shops along the way the sky looked pale and distant, as if it had nothing to do with what I was about to learn. And when I pulled into the parking lot, I did not rush to get out of the car. I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at the building in front of me, clean, neutral, the kind of place designed to feel calm no matter what happens inside. And I took a slow breath before stepping out, closing the door quietly behind me, as if sound itself needed to be controlled. And when I walked through the entrance, I noticed the scent first, that familiar sterile cleanliness, followed by the soft hum of voices and footsteps, people moving through their routines, checking in, waiting, leaving, all of it ordinary, all of it structured, and I approached the front desk. with the same calm I had practiced all morning, giving Daniel's full name, saying I believed he had been here recently, and the woman behind the desk looked at her screen, her expression professional but not distant, and there it was again, that pause, that slight hesitation that had become so familiar, and she told me that she could not provide details without authorization. But her tone was not dismissive. It carried something else, something careful, and I nodded as if I expected that answer. Because I did, and I thanked her without asking anything further, because I had not come for a direct answer. I had come to confirm something else, something less obvious. And as I stepped away from the desk, I did not leave the building. Instead, I walked slowly down the hallway, past waiting areas and closed doors, reading the small signs posted beside each section, until I reached the one I had seen on the website the night before, hospice care, and I stood there for a moment, not entering, just observing, the quiet of that space different from the rest of the building, softer, more contained, and I watched as a nurse passed by, her movements gentle, unhurried, and I realized that whatever had happened to Daniel, it had likely unfolded here, in a place designed for time to slow down, for moments to stretch quietly without interruption, and I felt something shift inside me, not grief, not yet, but recognition, because this was the kind of place where a mother should have been called, where time is measured in visits, in conversations, in presence, and I had not been there, not once, and that absence no longer felt like an oversight. It felt deliberate, and I turned away from the sign, walking back toward the main hallway, not because I had found everything, but because I had found enough for now, enough to understand that the timeline I had been given had been carefully narrowed to exclude this entire chapter, and as I reached the exit, I noticed a small bulletin board near the door, filled with printed notices, thank you cards, and memorial acknowledgments, and I slowed down just enough to look at them, not searching, just allowing my eyes to pass over each one, until they stopped, not abruptly, but with a quiet certainty, on a name I recognized instantly, Daniel Collins, printed in simple black letters beneath a small message of remembrance, and I stood there without moving, reading the date, letting it settle into place beside everything else I had already gathered, and I understood then that the truth had never been completely hidden. It had been placed just out of reach, in spaces people assume you will not look. And I did not take a picture, I did not ask anyone about it. I simply memorized it. Every detail, every line, and then I turned and walked out of the building the same way I had entered, quietly, without drawing attention, because now I knew something I had not known before, not just that Daniel was gone, but that there had been time, real time, and I had been kept away from it, and that realization settled into something steady and unshakable, because whatever had been done could no longer remain hidden, not from me. When I got back to my car, I did not start the engine right away. I simply sat there with my hands resting in my lap, letting the name I had just seen settle into something real, something that could no longer be explained away by confusion or distance or misunderstanding. Because there it was, in plain sight, a printed acknowledgement that carried more truth than anything I had been told, and I repeated the date in my mind, slowly, carefully, aligning it with the last transaction I had seen, the last time Daniel's life had left a mark in a system that could not be easily erased, and the two matched more closely than they should have if everything had been handled the way it was supposed to be, and I understood then that what I was looking at was not just absence. It was a complete sequence that had unfolded without me, from his final days in that quiet wing of the medical center to the acknowledgement of his passing placed quietly on a board where only those who happened to look would find it. And I sat there thinking about all the moments that should have existed between those 2 points, the phone call that should have come, the drive I should have made, the conversations I should have had, the chance to sit beside him, to hear his voice one last time. And none of those moments had been given to me, not because they did not exist, but because someone had decided I would not be part of them. And I thought about Jessica again, not in anger, not yet, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost detached, because everything I had seen so far fit into the same pattern, the careful control, the measured information, the way she shaped what others were allowed to know and when they were allowed to know it. And I realized that this was not something done in a moment of panic or grief. This was something that required planning, timing, decisions made step by step, while everything else appeared normal on the surface. And I reached for my notebook again, flipping it open to the page where I had written down the earlier details, and I added the date from the board, writing it neatly, precisely, as if the act of writing it made it more real, more anchored. And then I sat back and looked at the page, at the timeline that was beginning to form. And for the first time I could see the outline of what had happened. Not every detail, not every conversation, but enough to understand the shape of it. Enough to know that Daniel had not simply disappeared into that vague sentence I had been given. He had lived through days that were structured, documented, witnessed by others, just not by me. And that realization settled into something deeper than shock. It became a kind of quiet certainty, because once you see the shape of something, you cannot unsee it. And I knew then that the next step was not to confront Jessica with what I had found. Not yet. Because confrontation without complete understanding only gives the other person time to adjust their story, to close whatever small openings remained. And I was not ready to lose those openings. Not when they were finally beginning to reveal something solid. And instead I thought about what comes after a person passes, the processes that follow, the paperwork, the decisions that need to be made. And I knew that somewhere within those processes there would be records that could not be hidden so easily. Records that required names, signatures, dates that matched, and I closed the notebook again, placing it carefully on the passenger seat beside me. And I started the engine, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a steady understanding that I was no longer searching blindly. I was following a path that had already been laid out, and every step I took from this point forward would bring me closer to the part of the story that had been kept from me, not by accident, but by design. And that knowledge did not make me feel overwhelmed. It made me patient, because patience is what allows you to see what others hope you will miss. I did not go home right away after leaving the medical center. Instead, I drove a few blocks past it and pulled into a small parking lot beside a closed hardware store, the kind of place no one notices in the middle of the day, and I turned off the engine, letting the quiet settle around me as I looked again at the notebook on the passenger seat, because what I had now was not just suspicion, it was a sequence, and sequences can be tested, verified, expanded, and I understood that the next layer would not be found in places designed for privacy, but in places where process requires visibility, and that meant legal records, official filings, the kind of documentation that exists not for families, but for systems. And I reached for my phone again, this time searching for the county records office, something I had never needed before, something most people never think about until they are forced to. And I found the website, simple, structured, offering access to public filings, probate cases, certificates, all listed in a way that felt distant from the weight they actually carry. And I entered Daniel's full name carefully, not rushing, not expecting immediate clarity, but the results appeared faster than I anticipated. And there it was, a listing, recent, unmistakable, tied to his name in a way that confirmed everything the silence had tried to obscure. And I opened it slowly, reading each line with the same measured attention I had given everything else. And what I saw did not shock me in the way it might have hours ago, because by now I had already begun to understand the pattern. But it did something else. It completed it. It filled in the space that had been left deliberately blank, and I saw that a filing had been made, not days after his passing, but almost immediately, and the name attached to it as the primary contact, the executor, the one responsible for handling everything that followed, was Jessica Collins. And I sat there looking at that name for a long time, not because I did not expect it, but because seeing it in that context changed something. It moved her role from assumption to confirmation, from suspicion to fact. And I continued reading, noting the dates, the sequence of actions, the way everything had been processed quickly, efficiently, as if there had been no delay, no uncertainty, no need to wait for anyone else to be present or informed. And I noticed something else, something smaller, but just as important. There was no secondary contact listed, no mention of next of kin beyond what was required, no indication that anyone else had been involved. And that absence spoke louder than anything else, because it showed not just who was included, but who had been intentionally left out. And I leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to let that realization settle fully, because this was no longer about missing information. It was about controlled access, about decisions made at every step to ensure that I remained outside of the process. And I thought about how easily it could have been different, how one phone call, one message, One simple act could have changed everything. And yet none of that had happened. Not because it could not, but because it was never meant to. And when I opened my eyes again, I did not feel the need to rush anywhere or call anyone. Because the urgency I had felt earlier had been replaced by something far more useful, something steady and deliberate. And that was understanding, because now I knew not just that I had been excluded, but how. And once you understand how something is done, you begin to see where it can be undone. And I placed the phone back on the seat beside the notebook, looking at both as if they were pieces of the same structure. And I realized that everything Jessica had done relied on one assumption, that I would accept the silence, that I would stop at the first answer I was given, that I would not look beyond what was placed in front of me. And that assumption was the only weakness in an otherwise careful design. And I knew then that I did not need to confront her yet. I did not need to raise my voice or demand explanations, because I was no longer standing outside without direction. I was standing at the edge of something that was already beginning to reveal itself, and all I had to do now was take the next step, not loudly, not quickly, but precisely, because precision is what turns quiet understanding into something that cannot be ignored. That evening, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I called a lawyer, not out of anger, not out of desperation, but because I understood that what I was holding in my hands was no longer just a personal matter. It had entered a space where facts, timelines, and documentation carry weight in a way that emotions cannot. And I chose a firm I had heard about years ago, one that handled estates and probate matters. And when the receptionist answered, I spoke calmly, giving my name, explaining only that I needed to understand the process surrounding a recent filing connected to my son, and she scheduled a consultation for the next morning without asking too many questions, which I appreciated because I was not ready to explain everything. Not yet. And after I ended the call, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same place where all of this had begun, with the notebook open in front of me, the dates, the names, the small pieces of truth laid out in a way that no longer felt scattered. And I realized that for the first time since I heard those words on the phone, I was not searching anymore. I was preparing. And there is a difference between the two that changes how you move, how you think, how you speak. And I went through each detail again, not questioning it, but confirming it. The final transaction near the medical center, the absence of any funeral records in the places that should have had them, the acknowledgement posted quietly in a hallway that few would think to check, and the legal filing completed with a precision that left no room for delay, and each piece supported the others, forming something solid, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. And I closed the notebook slowly, placing my hand over it for a moment as if to steady everything inside it. And I thought about Jessica, about the way she had spoken, the way she had chosen her words carefully, offering just enough to end the conversation without opening any further questions. And I understood now that what she had relied on was not just control, but assumption, the assumption that I would accept what I was given, that I would remain in the place she had assigned me, outside of the process, outside of the truth. And that assumption had held everything together, quietly, efficiently, until now. And I stood up from the table and walked over to the cabinet where I keep important documents, pulling out an old folder that still held copies of family records, birth certificates, old insurance papers, things that most people only look at when they are forced to. And I added my notebook to that folder, placing it carefully inside, not as something temporary, but as something that belonged there, something that had become part of a larger record. And I closed the cabinet with a soft click, the sound small but final in a way that felt significant. And I did not call Jessica that night. I did not send a message. I did not ask for explanations, because I understood that the moment I spoke, she would adjust, she would respond, she would begin to reshape the narrative in whatever way she believed would protect her. And I was not ready to give her that opportunity, not when the truth was still unfolding in its original form, untouched. And instead I prepared quietly, reviewing the address of the law office, setting out my clothes for the morning, small, ordinary actions that felt almost routine, and yet carried a weight I had not felt before, because they were no longer about moving through a normal day. They were about stepping into a position where I would no longer be on the outside. And as I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, I did not feel the need to replay everything again in my mind. I did not feel the confusion that had followed me earlier, because clarity had replaced it. Not complete, not final, but enough to move forward without hesitation. And as I laid down in bed, the house quiet around me, I understood one simple thing with absolute certainty, that whatever had been done quietly, whatever had been arranged without me, had already left behind everything I needed to bring it into the open, and I would do that not with noise, not with anger, but with something far more difficult to ignore, the truth, placed exactly where it could no longer be avoided.